Podemos comenzar, si les parece bien. Sí. Bueno, buenos días. Quiero comenzar con un agradecimiento a los organizadores de la Semana de Medio Oriente y Norte de África en su edición 2025, quienes hacen posible este tipo de charlas relevantes, no solo por la importancia que tiene Sudán en la región del norte de África, sino dada la dimensión de la crisis humanitaria que ha alcanzado el conflicto en este país desde 2023, cuando bueno, estalla ahí una guerra civil. Y pues en ese sentido es para mí un gusto, un honor moderar esta mesa a cargo de la doctora Seri-Hersch, eh, eh, que se titula, el título de su presentación es precisamente Researching Sudan on the Midst of and Beyond Armed Conflict, investigar Sudán durante y más allá del conflicto armado. Y seguramente esta presentación nos dará herramientas y pistas para entender el tipo de violencia y conflicto que vemos en Sudán, ¿no? Causas profundas, históricas, etc. Bueno, antes de darle la palabra a la doctora, voy a leer una breve semblanza suya. Iris Seri-Hersch es profesora asociada en estudios modernos sobre Oriente Medio en la Universidad de Marseille, Francia, y está especializada en la historia de Sudán, Palestina e Israel desde el siglo XIX hasta la actualidad. Sus intereses de investigación incluyen las zonas fronterizas, las políticas y prácticas educativas, la historia colonial, los conflictos territoriales y la memoria social, así como archivos locales y la historia medioambiental. Ha publicado y coeditado libros sobre la enseñanza de la historia en el Sudán anglo-egipcio, la historia social sudanesa, las apropiaciones espaciales en los imperios modernos, así como los recursos naturales y el colonialismo en Oriente Medio y el norte de África. Actualmente está terminando un libro sobre la historia de Al-Zarqa, la única aldea costera palestina que ha sobrevivido a la Nakba de 1948. Bueno, entonces es un enorme placer tenerte aquí. Seri, adelante.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this presentation, and I want really to thank all the organizers of this wonderful Middle Eastern week, and I want to thank especially Nofret Hernandez, who invited me to come. So it's really a pleasure to be here to discover Mexico, because it's also my first time, as for other people. And it's really nice also to be in another academic community and to share all our thoughts. So thank you so much. So this talk will basically be about the book you can see here that I co-edited with several colleagues on Sudan. So the goal is to present some recent research on Sudan, but also to to situate this research in the wider context of Sudan studies. And I think there will be some threads also that are common with what Yasmin Bariad presented, especially with regards to social history and maybe ordinary people. So I will start with the starting point, and I start with a question because I was wondering how to engage this discussion with you today. I'm talking about Sudan. We are in Mexico, and I'm based in France. So should I start with the current war in Sudan, or should I start with a case of transnational Sudanese Mexican history? So I will first develop this point. Then I will ask why and how we can bring ordinary people back into Sudan studies and why it's important in this case. And then we will see if we have time, but I will also showcase some parts of the book to show how Sudan scholars, historians, politicists, and anthropologists have explored the everyday doing and undoing of the state. So, if I could have started this talk by, describing the current civil or internal war that has been ongoing for 2.5 years in Sudan since April 2023, and which basically opposes two generals, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is basically the commander of the Sudan's National Army, and Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, who is also known as Hemeti, who leads a paramilitary force, but a very powerful military force, called the Rapid Support Forces. So you can see on this map which force controls which territory. Sudan is huge, like not relatively to Mexico, but in Africa it's quite huge. And so you can see that the national forces control mainly the northern and the southern eastern parts. It's in red, and the paramilitary force controls the zone in blue. And it recently took over El Fasher, which is the capital city of Darfur. So it's a main, main place. So there is a debate about how to call this war. Is it an internal war? Is it a civil war? Is it a regional war? Some people wouldn't call it a civil war because it started really as a fight between the two military commanders over resources and power. What are the resources? It's land and gold, mostly in Sudan now. And it's not a war between various components of the Sudanese population. Even if now many people are enrolled in the war, the Sudanese population mainly is the victim of this war between two military commanders. What is interesting is that these two men were formerly allies, and they together staged a coup d'etat, a military coup, in October 2021, through which they overthrew the government that had been set up after the revolution in 2019. There was a popular revolution that overthrew a 30-year-long dictatorship, the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir, and afterwards there was a kind of civil military government. It was a mixed government that was set up, and it was a kind of transitional era with elections that were due to take place in 2022. But in the meantime, these two military commanders, high commanders, senior officials, staged the coup. Afterwards, they disagreed mainly over the position of the RSF within Sudan, and Hemeti opposed the integration actually of the paramilitary forces into the regular army, and that's how the actual war started. So of course, the war had devastating results in terms of human casualties caused by direct fighting and killings, but also by droughts and forced displacement. And it's so bad that this has been called the worst humanitarian crisis by the UN in the world. There are millions of people that lack access to water, food, medical treatment, and so there is also death by just starving and disease. Just a few figures. There are estimates because we don't have very accurate figures, but according to the estimates, there have been more than 200,000 people who have died in these 2.5 years. 12 million people that have become internally displaced people, and 2 million refugees abroad. Those who can afford went abroad. And about half the Sudanese population, that is 24 million people, face acute food insecurity. And now very recently with the seizing of El Fasher, there were again like massacres on a large scale, maybe a genocide, it's also debated now, of thousands of civilians by the RSF, by Hemeti forces. It's also a very under-mediatized war, as I think you are aware. You know, this Sudanese war rarely appears on international news headlines, especially compared to the Ukraine and the Gaza wars. And I think that this glaring imbalance is rooted in a media economy and architecture of knowledge that has marginalized the so-called global south, especially the poorest countries of Africa and Asia. And it's not new, it's since the invention of television in the mid-20th century. And this media economy is also, of course, shaped by the colonial past and its linguistic and political legacies. For instance, Latin American countries are much more covered by Spanish media than, say, French media, of course, which more readily look at Algeria or Senegal. So with regards to Sudan, I would say that it gets a little more coverage in Britain, especially by the BBC and The Guardian, than in the rest of Europe, because it was once part of the British Empire. But Qatari-based Al Jazeera is probably the foreign media that has given the most detailed and consistent coverage of the Sudanese war, thanks to its wide network of Arabic-speaking correspondents. But I want also to emphasize the role of Sudanese independent media, which are not very known, but which do exist, such as Sudan Tribune, Dabanga, and the website, the Atar website. They have people both inside Sudan and outside Sudan, and they continue, covering the events, and they provide vital information and personal stories also, both in Arabic and English for Dabanga and Atar, whereas Sudan Tribune is in English only, I think. So this war also, of course, has caused damage to infrastructures and buildings, including hospitals, but also for the purpose of this talk, damage to libraries, museums, archival centers, and universities. So you can see some of the examples here. On the left-hand side, you see the library of one very important research center that was in Omdurman, so it's just on the other side of the Nile, it's next to the capital of Khartoum. And so the library was totally destroyed. And then you can also see the Sudan National Museum in Khartoum, pictures from March this year. So there is also the looting of artifacts and a whole, war economy around this. Also, the University of Khartoum, here you see the part of the Faculty of Medicine was also partly destroyed. So there has been interruption of studies and schools and universities. And beforehand, I talked about mass population movements inside and outside the country. And of course, this mass population movement has also included scholars and students. So people had to move. And we have an interesting report about exactly, the impact of the war on Sudan's higher education and academic research community by Muna El-Gaddal and Rebecca Blade. So I wanted to emphasize, the multifaceted impact of this war on current and future research in and on Sudan. So there are a lot of lingering questions and pressing issues regarding the fate of archives, universities, academic staff, the training of students, international collaborations, and so on. So that was my first thread, and now I'm going to the second one. Alternately, I could have started this presentation by presenting innovative historical research linking Sudan to Mexico through Egypt and France. And I want to talk about my colleague Heather Sharkey's research. She's from the University of Pennsylvania in the US. And 2 years ago, she published two very interesting articles on Sudanese soldiers who traveled as far as Mexico in the 1860s, in the very years when the Suez Canal was being dug in Egypt. And these Sudanese soldiers, they went there to take part in the French invasion of Mexico. So you can see one of them here, whose portrait was staged in a nice studio in Paris when he came back after the short-lived French invasion of Mexico. So it's interesting because Heather Shorkey, she reconstructs the trajectory of this group of about 400 Sudanese men, most of whom had been captured as slaves in southern Sudan and brought to Egypt to serve with the Egyptian army before being taken by a French ship to Veracruz. So, you know, I tried to draw this little map to show the connections. So maybe I will just give you a bit of a context because I'm not sure that everyone knows this history of Sudan and Egypt, but I won't be long. So again, maps I think are helpful here. We are talking about the 19th century, and I will just remind that Egypt was an Ottoman province that started to act as a mini empire, that Egypt sought autonomy from the Ottoman center in Istanbul, and the Egyptian army conquered quite a lot of territories. And among the territories that Ottoman Egypt conquered, there was Sudan, starting in 1820. So the Egyptians set up, you know, a new administration in Sudan. It was known as the Turco-Egyptian rule because it was Ottoman Egyptian. And one of the characteristics of this new rule was the growing of the slave trade. The slave trade was very ancient in those regions, but under Egyptian rule, it really increased also because of steamship navigation. Because from the mid-19th century, steamships were able to go up the Nile and to go to the southern regions of Sudan, and it was mainly in the southern regions that people were raided as slaves. Who were the slave raiders? It was northern Sudanese people, Egyptians, but also Europeans that took part in this slave trade in the 19th century. So that's in this context that Sudanese people were brought to Egypt to serve in the army, and then some of them were taken as far as Mexico. Now, in the Americas, you know this history much better than me, but I still have to say some things. We are at the time that French, like in France, it's French Emperor Napoleon III in the 1950s and 60s. Napoleon III dreamt of reviving the French Empire in the Americas after France had lost almost all its colonial territories in Northern and Central America. So I'm speaking about the 1763 loss of French territories to the British, and then we had this US independence in 1776, and then in 1803 Louisiana was sold by Napoleon I to the US, and the French also lost Haiti because there was this slave revolt in Haiti whereby the Haitians became independent. So France lost everything in the Americas. As you know very well, Mexico had been independent since 1821, but it faced an economic crisis after the end of a civil war in 1861 under liberal president Benito Juarez, who was very, at the time the Mexican state was very much indebted to European creditors, including France. And Napoleon III had also commercial interest in Mexico and Central America, including the idea of digging a canal in Nicaragua that would link, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and stir up trade. And it was, of course, before the Panama Canal was dug. I think it was at the very beginning of the 20th century. And Napoleon III, finally, he was also fascinated by his uncle, Napoleon I, who had conquered Egypt, in 1798, and whose conquest was both a military and an intellectual, kind of scientific conquest, sending all these French science men to study Egypt, to study the ancient civilizations of Egypt. And Napoleon III also thought about studying the pre-Hispanic or pre-Columbian civilizations of Mexico. So Napoleon, in the end of 1861, invaded Mexico, and he tried to establish a Catholic monarchy headed by the brother of actually the Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph. So he managed to convince Ferdinand Maximilian to have this monarchy, but as you know, I think there was very strong Mexican resistance and opposition to that project, and Maximilian and his wife Charlotte also fell ill. There were many problems, and in the end, in 1867, the French had to disengage, to leave Mexico, including the Sudanese soldiers that had been engaged, on the French side. So that's for the context. So what's interesting about Sharkey's research is how she points to the absence of Sudanese soldiers from most of the French and Mexican scholarship dealing with this episode. So she tries, to locate, to find these Sudanese actors. She draws on micro-historical methods. So she tried to weave together very different types of archives and sources. For example, military records, French military records, including medical files, drawings, and photographs. She found one personal memoir by a former soldier, but these memoirs are very rare because most of them didn't know how to write or didn't left, written traces. And so she explores this specific configuration. And I think what is very interesting is how she links geographical spaces that are usually considered separately. So you don't find a lot of work, that would link Sudan, Egypt, Algeria, France, and Mexico, as well as the US. She brings out European racial constructions of Sudanese men as supposedly immune to disease. That's why they were recruited, because you could ask, why were Sudanese, sent to Mexico? Because there were theories according to which they were more immune to disease, especially to yellow fever, and so that they were particularly fit for warfare, and so they were really a sought-after resource. Even though we know that in practice, many of them fell ill, actually, in Mexico. Sharkey also studies the cultural difficulties the Sudanese faced in Mexico. It's interesting to see that they encountered Algerian soldiers there in Mexico, who were also recruited in the French army. Remember that France started to conquer Algeria in 1830. But the Sudanese and the Algerians in Mexico could not communicate easily, because the Sudanese, they mostly spoke a kind of Arabic that is called Juba Arabic, or Arabi Juba, from southern Sudan, and the Algerians would talk Algerian Arabic, or also Amazigh or Berber. And finally, Sharkey shows that this military experience in Faro, Mexico, created opportunities for upward mobility for Sudanese men who often had a slave history. And in fact, when they returned to France and then to Egypt, many of them were rewarded the French Légion d'honneur. So, it's like a medalla, and it's what you can see here on this portrait. And these Sudanese, they also received honors from the Egyptian governor, Khedive Ismail, and they were promoted to upper military grades. And so some did not survive, the journey, the war and then the journey, but those who had survived and who went back later continued to fight in other wars in Sudan, in Egypt, and in the Horn of Africa. So actually, this Mexican episode was a kind of stage in their military career. So now I'm again looking at these two threads, and this was the meaning of amid and beyond of my general title. So how can Sudan scholars take on a double challenge? And now I'm zooming out. Namely, on the one hand, how can we conduct research in a country that has known many and prolonged civil wars since its independence in 1956? So it's just a small resume, a summary of the different wars in the post-colonial era between the North and the South. So most of the post-colonial era was actually wartime. There is also the war between the Khartoum central government and Darfuri rebel movements in the 80s, and then again from the 2003. And in 2011, Sudan, which until then included Sudan and South Sudan, got partitioned into two states. And since the partition, which is a result of the preceding civil wars, there has been civil wars inside each of the Sudans. So in South Sudan from 2013, and in Sudan now more recently. So if we look at this, we understand that peaceful years are very rare moments, and it has been this for a long time. So there is a very complicated access both to archives and fieldwork, and so people have to find strategies, you know, to just to study Sudan, be it local scholars or foreign scholars. So that's the first challenge, and then the second challenge, at the same time, I think we should avoid viewing the Sudans solely through their armed conflicts. So even if it's essential to study those wars, those conflicts, it's likewise crucial to research Sudanese history, societies, politics, and cultures with different interpretative grids in various contexts and in their own right. And as a historian, I consider that it's especially important to be aware of and avoid determinist traps, such as reading modern Sudanese history as a mere teleology of disaster. And I need to come back to this again, but it's just, you know, the tendency to read all Sudanese history as leading to the wars and to project, for example, the current war onto the past and not be able to see other developments, other processes, other groups. But we'll come back to that. So let me now introduce the book. This book, it's a 2-volume book that you can find online. It's totally open access. That was also important for us, so that anyone in the world can access it. It came out in the summer of 2023, just after the outbreak of the current war. But we produced it before the beginning of the war. So I come to my second main point. Why should ordinary people be studied, and how can ordinariness be defined? And I was asking this because I think maybe it can be interesting for other people working also on other, you know, countries. What is at stake here, and both in the specific context of Sudan studies and in the broader framework of Middle Eastern studies? So now I will develop this question. First, in contrast to MENA countries such as Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Syria, Turkey, Iran, Palestine, and Israel, Sudan has not attracted much scholarly attention. So that's the first point. This is not linked to territorial size, as Sudan, especially before the partition of 2011, was and still is a very large country. And as someone who also researches the history of Palestine and Israel, which is overcrowded with academics, I sometimes feel that the smaller the place, the biggest attention it gets, at least in my case. The same can be said for Sudan in the context of African studies, where other countries like Kenya, South Africa, or Senegal have more often been under the light of academic projectors. So why has been Sudan so much under-researched? And I think there are a number of reasons that can explain this situation. The first one is linked to its geographical location at a crossroads between the Arabic-speaking Middle East and so-called Sub-Saharan Africa. Sudan, in fact, has more often been left outside than included in these broad areas. And there has been a common perception of Sudan as an in-between zone rather than a historical center. So if I caricature it, it's like the Middle Eastern specialist would say, oh no, Sudan is part of Africa. And then the Africanist would say, oh no, Sudan is, you know, it's an Arab country, so then it falls between the chairs. Another reason is linked to the colonial history of Sudan. In the first half of the 20th century, Sudan was ruled by a dual administration known as the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. And these were like a bizarre, status. I think there is only one other case in the world. It was in the New Hebrides, like small islands, which were ruled by a French-British condominium. But this was, invited by Lord Cromer in Egypt in order to perform Egyptian sovereignty over Sudan, but not to raise the French jealousy or something like that. So it was like a compromise to say, okay, the British and the Egyptians, because the Egyptians had already ruled Sudan, now they are the masters of the country. But this means that this had also echoes in the academy. In colonial studies, for example, historians of the British Empire have rarely considered Sudan because they said, oh, it's an Anglo-Egyptian condominium, it's not a colony, it's not a settler colony, Third reason, the recurrent civil wars and political strife since independence, so it's also an obstacle to research. And then I will stress political authoritarianism also as a break to research. So of course, colonial rule was not democratic, but also after independence, we had several military dictatorships since 1956. And it's interesting because these different regimes could be enveloped in a socialist ideology, like under Jafar and Nimeri, or in an Islamist ideology under Ibrahim Aboud or Omar al-Bashir. But yeah, they were all led by military commanders. These regimes were brought down by popular uprising several times. So on several occasions, Sudan experienced parliamentary politics in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1980s. So, we have a kind of cycles, but these parliamentary experiences or episodes were short-lived because, again, there was all the time military coup, reinstalling a new dictatorship. And for example, after the last popular uprising, there was no election because there was this military coup d'etat in 2021. So if we make small mathematics, we see that there are 52 years of authoritarian rule. I know it's very schematic, but still it gives us an idea. And only 11 years of parliamentary politics and So this political authoritarianism coupled with economic hardships mean that even if there are many universities actually in Sudan, there has been a lack of academic freedom, paucity of resources for Sudanese students and scholars, and all this has led to a brain drain mainly to Gulf countries. So we see Sudanese academics going to Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, to Qatar, but also to the UK, to the US, to Canada, as well as Malaysia and Indonesia. So there is a huge challenge faced by the Sudanese academic community inside the country. This may also explain why Sudan scholars from various disciplines have knitted close ties. I think that Sudan studies has really developed as a multidisciplinary research field because there are not so many Sudan scholars. And in my own experience, for example, for my PhD on history teaching in colonial Sudan, I was not supervised by a Sudan specialist because there was none in France, but by a historian of Egypt, Ghislaine Alom. And I also got very useful advice from Sudan specialists that were not historians, social linguists or anthropologists, for example, Catherine Miller, Barbara Kashari, and others. And because of the relative paucity of research on Sudan, and because of all these civil wars, the research that does exist, there is research, has tended to focus on allied groups, impersonal structures, and international relations. So we see a heavy weight of political history, political science about Sudan. And for example, in history, we see more focus on Sudanese elites, political, intellectual elites, the Sudanese bourgeoisie, British colonial administrators have very much been researched, state institutions and policies, and then relations between Sudan and the neighboring countries. So there are lots of studies about Sudanese-Egyptian relations, Sudanese-Ethiopian relations, etc. But in this book, we were 5 co-editors and 21 contributors. We wanted to explore Sudanese history and politics more from below, so-called, contending that ordinary people have been central actors in the transformation of Sudanese societies. And I should make 2 comments here. This approach does not leave the state out of sight. We are not saying, okay, the state is irrelevant, we don't care of the state. Rather, we sought to understand how ordinary men and women have interacted with the state, how they have contributed to produce the state. So we're interested in the daily functioning of its institutions and what strategies they have developed also to resist the state. And the second comment is that we were not interested in ordinary people solely for the power to make or unmake political orders. So this book is also about what we can call the quiet history of the everyday, about what we can call ordinary worries and passions. For instance, asking a holy man for a charm against infertility, helping give birth, disobeying teachers at school, going to the cinema in the 1950s, playing manly games while drinking alcohol, and so on and so on. Now, if I have some more time, but I will have to cut a little bit. Let me say something about the concept of ordinariness. I think it can be tricky because of its very fuzziness. What is ordinariness? So I will just go over a few definitions that are useful to try and refine its meaning. Starting with historian and feminist scholar Joan Scott, who defines ordinary people as those who have been, quote, omitted or overlooked in accounts of the past. So it's still a very broad definition because, you know, who has been overlooked? Many people have been overlooked in accounts of the past. But I think it's interesting because of its focus on the politics of knowledge. So, you know, certain individuals and groups are left out of historical narratives. So that was an important point for us. A more common definition is the one used also by historian Wayne Tebrake, who has suggested a different definition of ordinary people are just those who are excluded from the realm of officialdom. So the ordinary people are subjects as opposed to rulers. We found this definition a little too static and displaying a simplified dichotomy between the rulers and the ruled, because more often than not, you know, people change their transformation and it's not so, so well distinguished. And then Raymond Williams, who is a literary critic, he pointed to an interesting ambiguity of ordinariness. According to him, ordinariness is oscillating between, on the one hand, what is regular, what is expected, that's from the later mood, and on the other hand, what is perceived as inferior or limited. I know that's ordinary, that's inferior, yeah. And so, drawing on that, he says that ordinary people designates a generalized body of others from the point of view of governing elites, who see them as people who lack power or undeserve any special gaze. And I will end with someone who studies the Middle East, Ziad Fahmy, who studies Egypt, and who takes the concept towards a more social cultural understanding. So for him, in late 19th century and early 20th century Egypt, ordinary people were those who shared the daily use of colloquial Arabic, Ammiya, as opposed to the Fusha literary language. And so he talks about ordinary Egyptians as a predominantly illiterate Egyptian society, but a society that was very active in the cultural field, a society that created, performed, and consumed poetry, songs, plays, and including the satirical press that was read aloud. You know, it was not only for literate people. So we have, in our books, we can find some concrete applications of these various definitions, especially John Scott's and Williams, maybe less the Tebrick definition. So for us, ordinary stands as a signpost for a wide range of social actors. Could be school pupils, policemen, soldiers, women writers and activists, homosexuals, cinema spectators, political movements from marginalized regions within Sudan, internal migrants, poor urban workers, rural midwives. So it's a very broad set of actors who had entirely different lives, aspirations, dreams, situations, and whose histories we need to know better, write about, and circulate. So it's a book that is very anchored in social history, with specific attention given to, you know, individuals and groups, and also politics from below, as looking at the agency of subaltern or marginalized actors, so to see how these people participate in the definition of power relations, how multiple actors shape politics on all levels, and so this is also linked to James Scott's concept of infra-politics, you know, doing politics on the everyday level, or something that is maybe not framed as formal politics, but that is politics. And so one concept that allows me to move from these theoretical considerations to the context in which the book was produced is, of course, the concept of situated knowledge, or knowledges in plural, and the S is important here, elaborated or at least popularized by philosopher, historian of science, and feminist thinker Donna Haraway. And I want to return to her concept because according to her, there exists only specific ways of seeing. So only partial, locatable, critical knowledges can create webs of connections and shared conversations. In her perspective, unlocated knowledge is and I quote, the irresponsible perspective of the master, the man, the one God, whose eye produces, appropriates, and orders all difference. So she's actually calling for debunking master narratives, like there is no one knowledge, you know, from above, but there are many different partial knowledges that can communicate and dialogue one with another. And so we started also from this point to argue and to maybe to emphasize that this book was conducted, research for this book was conducted in a specific political and historiographical context, as any research indeed. And I think that Yasmin also very much delved on the, you know, on the situated knowledge. And so in our cases, it was after the partition of Sudan into two states who already had prompted fresh reflections on the very field of Sudan studies. Because, you know, when the country was partitioned in 2011, we would ask, is it still relevant to do, what is Sudan studies now, you know? Should the two countries still be studied together? Would the political separation lead to an academic divorce? And so we wrote about this with some of the people, and we argued then that scholars should not necessarily mold their topics according to changing political boundaries. For example, here, historical relations and movements of people between northern and southern Sudan have been central for centuries, so they cannot be ignored just saying, okay, now there are the Sudan and South Sudan, so we should just each one of the respective specialists be in their own field. Then afterwards there was this, there were growing internal conflicts in both Sudans, so the civil war in the south. In the north, we had renewed tensions in marginalized areas and also economically driven protests in the main towns. There was economic protests because one of the reasons was that Sudan lost many oil revenues after the partition, because the main oil fields are in the south, and then when the south became independent, the north didn't have access anymore to these oil fields. But then these economic and economically driven uprising, like not uprising, but movements, they developed into a real, what we can call a popular revolution, a thawra, or a movement that called itself as such, and whose demands and slogans very much echoed the slogans that we heard in other Arab countries, you know, during the so-called Arab Spring. So I just put here an example, Madani Abbas. So it was the demand for a civil regime, for democracy. So Abbas is, yeah, Madaniya, as opposed to the Askari regime. This movement led to the removal of President Umar al-Bashir in April 2019. And so it's interesting because we organized an international conference in Paris. It was in December 2019, so it was after the fall of al-Bashir and after this new civil military government had been put in place, and so it was a very uncertain moment, but also very euphoric moment, because it was the start of the revolution. Like, people thought, maybe the regime has fallen, maybe we can, you know, really move to democracy, or at least to parliamentary politics. But in October 2021, there was this coup d'etat, and then the prime minister, who was someone from the civil society, an economist, Abdallah Hamdok, resigned. He was forced to resign after the coup in January 2022, and this confirmed that Sudan was heading into a counter-revolutionary phase. And it was the time the chapters for the book were being, you know, rewritten, assessed, and revised. So there was this whole political configuration moving on parallel to the making of the book. So the volatility and violence of this political configuration also fueled a sense of archival urgency in Sudan. At the same time, so there were local and foreign scholars who developed several projects aimed at collecting and preserving rare materials related to the revolution, but also to other events in Sudanese history. So it's just here an example, the Sudan Memory Project, which gathered British and Sudanese scholars, and which digitized hundreds of thousands of documents from the National Sudanese Archives, which you can see here. And, you know, and this was before the war, so there was already this sense of archival urgency in times of political uncertainty. How long should I, because...
maybe we can have 10 minutes more.
Okay, I will try to...
20 minutes to question from the audience.
Yes, okay. Yeah, good. So, and the book was also made in another much broader context. I think that is also relevant to Mexico, maybe in another way. It's the global economy of knowledge that is still characterized by glaring inequalities. You know, we are like 2 centuries after the independence of Latin American countries, and we are 60 years after the political decolonization of Africa and Asia, but still the main resources for knowledge production and dissemination continue to be concentrated in North America and Europe. And so this economy of knowledge shapes scholarly norms in the international arena, as you know. And so as book editors, we had to find a kind of compromise within these structural inequalities. So we had contributors from different countries and academic traditions, including Sudan, South Sudan, France, the UK, Italy, Germany, the US, and also Japan, even though the project entirely relied on financial support from the global north. One of our important goals also was to provide an international forum for Sudanese researchers who usually write and teach in Arabic. So some of the chapters were actually translated from, they were written in Arabic, and we had them translated from Arabic into English. Some of the chapters also lie at the intersection between what we could call standard academic writing and politically or socially engaged texts. What I mean is that some of the authors are or have been actors in the configurations they analyze. For example, a former policeman, he writes the history of the police, so what's his stance? And these provided interesting insiders' perspectives, and we assumed these individual subjectivities against over-uniformizing trends that tend to impoverish academic writing, but we had to find this balance. So, to conclude on this part, regarding Sudan studies, this book is also a reaction to some of the field silent features, and I will mention 4 of them. So it's a reaction against a powerful exceptionalist bias. Sudan is often presented as one in a kind, disconnected from larger trends, and we reacted against this. It's also a reaction against the Arabization paradigm that has been very present to interpret Sudan's history over the long term. What is the Arabization paradigm? Is to reduce Sudanese history to the gradual penetration of external tribes from the Arabian Peninsula and the ensuing cultural Arabization of Sudanese populations through intermarriage and Islamic learning. So yeah, there were migrations, they occurred, but not the whole history is about, external input and then a higher hierarchization of different tribes. Thirdly, it's also a reaction to the deterministic vision of Sudan's recent history. So it's against the teleology of disaster, or this kind of closed circle reasoning that only the present is framed in terms of violence failure, and then the past also is viewed in terms of violence and failure. And the fourth thing is the underrepresentation of women as subjects, objects, and producers of scholarship. So there are quite a lot of chapters and also authors who are women or on women or gender issues. So we tried to paint a very different picture. Sudan deeply embedded global and regional dynamics and a set of places and situations where ordinary people make their own history, and it's not always the international actors or only the elites that make these histories. I should also point to an important limitation of the book is the underrepresentation of South Sudan, and it's very linked to the composition of the academic community who produced the book. The majority of us specialize in the northern Sudan, so of course it's more about the north than about the south. But there are 1 or 2 chapters on South Sudan. So that's just I don't know if you can see it, but it's the table of contents. And I will just finish by pointing to the main themes and problems that structure the book, because we also chose not to divide the book into disciplinary fields. We could have chosen to organize the book according to, you know, history and then political science, and then, no, we didn't want that. We really wanted to crisscross the disciplinary perspectives on issues. So we had a first bunch of chapters on social history, political engagement, and archival issues. Then another part on retrieving women's agency in Sudanese history and society, and it's from very different periods, from the Funj era, so it's the 18th century, until the latest revolution. So, you know, women appear as actors in very different configurations. We had a set of chapters on armed men between global connections and local practices, including Sharkey's work on the Sudanese who went to Mexico. Then a part on urban life, queer history, and leisure in colonial times, and this is also quite new for Sudan studies, you know, in social history, to study things like homophobia and alcohol drinking practices, etc. Labor, identities, practices, and institutions, so the whole questions around labor in very different situations. And here we have a chapter on midwifery in the Nuba Mountains, South Kordofan, from actually an anthropologist, but it's a bit of historical anthropology. And then the last part was about the ordinary doing and undoing of the establishment. So how, you know, ordinary people participate in the doing and the undoing of the state in different configurations. So, for example, the first chapter is on the Mahadist state. It's an independent Islamic state in Sudan that came after Turco-Egyptian rule, after a revolution, a Sudanese revolution. And so how the ideology of this Islamic state was projected onto society in Eastern Sudan, and how people, you know, incorporated or not this ruling or dominant ideology. But also after independence, you know, in a 1964 revolution, how political movements developed in Sudan's peripheries and tried to claim a space in the independent state. So it's also about the making of citizenship after independence, and what citizenship means for different people, different groups of people in Sudan. And then the last two chapters, they are about the Umar al-Bashir 30-year-long rule. My chapter is about the link between education and violence, and I focus on military science textbooks, so Ulum Askaria, and how after a peace agreement between the North and the South, the military sciences were still taught, and how they were taught, to what end, and how they actually produced or sought to produce consent to violence, even in those times of so-called peace. And then the last one is about, how ordinary inhabitants of popular neighborhoods in Khartoum incorporated the dominant ideology and how they were co-opted by the state. So it's also about how a military Islamic state managed to create so-called grassroots organizations to co-opt people, sometimes migrant or nomadic people, into a repressive structure. Yeah, I will stop it. Thank you so much for attention.
So, thank you, Iris, for this very in-depth presentation. I will be really looking forward for reading your book. So the floor is open to question, reaction from the audience. I don't know if someone wants to formulate.
We will take 2 or 3, and it's okay, Iris? 2 or 3, and then you answer.
Yes.
Okay.
We'll see.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. I'm curious. I have I have a question about categories, because of course, you know, all our knowledges are situated. I follow you, and because of my own training and trajectory, I appreciate the ordinary, but I was struck by that choice vis-a-vis two terms that I was encouraged and introduced to as a student and encouraged to use analytically, which would be the popular in Stuart Hall's rendering, which makes it a field, right? I mean, the popular is, like an encounter, the encounter between this ordinary and, different forms of hegemony or different agents of hegemony, right? So this domain of like, yes, shared, but tense culture. No? And then, of course, the subaltern, and I'm thinking about Guha and Spivak's, definition, and subaltern studies as a field, and actually the emergence of popular and subaltern as a joint sort of endeavor in through the crossing of South Asian subaltern studies, Latin American subaltern studies, and Middle Eastern subaltern studies. No, so I was curious about that choice. I mean, I know Fahmi's work and book, right? So I understand. I was struck by how you go back to Scott and to Raymond Williams. So I thought it was an unusual theoretical sort of cluster, let's call it. And why not the popular or the subaltern? Because it's also a political choice in a sense, right? Because both of those also signal particular kinds of politics. For Hall, in terms of a transition from the pre-industrial to the capitalist, in terms of Guha, in relation to colonialism as a project, right? And I was just curious, because you're interested in this globalizing or sort of linking this ordinary Sudanese history to other regions. If you're aware of Shireen Say Ali's work on her her latest project, which is actually a family history of her Palestinian grandfather as a British doctor in Sudan. And the way in which regional elites were trained and then incorporated and deployed as vectors of colonial projects. Right?
Someone else has questions?
Yes, thank you, Iris, for your presentation, and it was really nice also to move beyond all these terrible images of violence that are really so present these days, and to also try to think beyond that through your talk. And so, starting with the first entry point that you took about this very, I don't know, precarious political situation that is changing all the time, etc. So I was wondering, how do you, as a researcher, navigate this kind of context? As what I understood from what you were saying, is probably one of the factors that made so very few researchers start working on Sudan. So you are working, and you've been working on it for a long time. How do you navigate that this situation? And what does it do to your research? How do you adapt it? Does it do something to the way you approach the kind of questions you're working on, but also the material, your access to the field, etc., and how you adapt to it? And my second question was more because I couldn't really identify from the authors what is the percentage of Sudanese authors who participated in the book? How is it represented? Maybe you can say something about that, also about the Sudanese authors or the production that is possible in such a context. And just more of a comment, maybe in relation to what Camila just said. I'm going more to the word of politics from below, which I've been using a lot too, and I've become a bit. I think it's become difficult to use it because you have the idea that there is the below and then the state is up there, and as you said yourself, it is somehow everywhere in the state, because the below is producing the state, so it's co-producing it. So yeah, I just wonder how pertinent the term still is. Actually, although I use it, I have to say.
Someone else? Another question? Yes? Okay, and then maybe another round.
Thank you for your talk. I look forward to reading the chapters in the book. I know it's a lot of, must have been a lot of work to organize something so massive. You talked about a lot of the different challenges and the ways you're challenging frameworks and understandings. But one topic that you didn't mention, which caught my attention, is that this is a huge historical sweep of, I forget the exact years, but 500 years, basically. So I was just wondering if you, I invite you to share with us you and your editor's insistence on having this broad longue durée look at Sudan, not just from independence, let's say, or even since the Egyptian, Anglo-Egyptian condominium. Why were you invested in having a longue durée? And I find it refreshing, and I like that. I couldn't read all the names of the authors, but like it reminded me of recently. I think I've been listening to and reading Nasreen El-Amin's work on Sudan, and so she's been making this argument that to understand famine and hunger, you have to actually, it's not something that's happened in the last 2-3 years, but she's pushing us to think in a longue durée. So maybe she's in this book, I didn't see, but it seems consistent or resonates with that. So yeah, so I was curious if you could share with us what discussions you may have had with the editors about thinking about time as a way to challenge the categories, or as a useful way to make the ordinary, the concept of the ordinary more powerful, maybe.
So you can answer this. We can start by answering these first three questions, and then we can.
It's already quite helpful. Thank you so
Yes,
much for all your questions and remarks. So it's really helpful. So I will take them just in the order. So for Camila, yes, we had quite a lot of discussions also among us, because you know how a book works. Sometimes you have a conference, then you have a book, but it's not everything is linear. So the initial conference was on social history, but it was not ordinary and stuff. So it's more about, it was more, I think, pragmatic, basing on what we had to link also all together these different threads. And it's true that we didn't, in the introduction of the book, I think we didn't really develop, the distinctions between, for example, and it's very useful, it would be very useful, ordinary and subaltern. But I think that giving all the different cases we have, subaltern, for example, which is very relevant for, many places, not only South Asia and Latin America, although these have been dominant. It could be very relevant for Sudan, for Palestine, for many different. It would be too narrow for this book, because some of the chapters would not fit into the subaltern studies. For example, here I have in front of my eyes a chapter by Harry Cross about industrial relations in a British bank, in the 1960s Sudan, so just after independence. And it's not about the lowest ranking, employees who try to engage to claim more rights. It's also about middle ranking and the British and the Sudanese people who work in this British bank. So I think subaltern maybe would have fitted some of the chapters, but it would have been too narrow and maybe not fitting as a whole. So that was the case. But actually, it's interesting because recently I looked at there is this handbook of subaltern studies that came out maybe a few years ago, and I saw that really most of the chapters, and there are many chapters, like 60 chapters, the Routledge handbook of subaltern studies, and most of them are about India, about the Americas, North and South and Central America, and some African case studies like South Africa, but there is nothing on the Middle East. And I was like, it's funny, you still see the weight of the historiographical traditions here, and so, and popular would even, it would fit some of the, again, the chapters, but not quite all. For example, Barbara Kashari, who is an anthropologist, she studied the working class neighborhood in Khartoum, and I think she would agree with this, popular category. So maybe I think ordinary was also a reaction to this heavy elitist bias in Sudan studies. Maybe it was just also that, while still encompassing most of the chapters. And then, you mentioned Shirin Sekali study. Yes, I read her article, and it's very interesting because I think it's micro-history, but also transnational history, and it involves Sudan and Palestine. So I'm very interested in that. How do I navigate? Yes, okay. I think I was lucky also, like the access to fieldwork, because I started working on Sudan after the 2005 peace agreement between the North and the South. So it was quite easy to go there and to do fieldwork and to go to the archives. So it was for my master's degree and then my PhD. And then later on it was more difficult. So I had different strategies. I had a strategy of using materials I had collected, when I was there. So I also used it later because I had a chance to collect quite many materials. So that was good. I don't know if it was deliberate or not, but if I was really conscious or not that, the context is so volatile because I was younger. So when you are young, you are more spontaneous, and you just I want to collect materials, but I don't think I was so conscious of it. And then maybe I was also lucky because I started to work on this Palestinian village that is now in Israel, and whose origins are, for some of them, in Sudan. And so that brought me to another fieldwork, and so I was okay. That was also a change for me from one fieldwork to another. And still, I mean, there are still problems, but another solution, it's a bit frustrating, but it's also to work with online materials. I talked about digitized materials, and that's very precious in those times that you cannot go. Another strategy that I didn't espouse, but that many other people did, is to work among Sudanese diasporas. But that's more for, geographers, anthropologists. So people developed projects on Sudanese in Egypt, Sudanese in France, Sudanese, and etc. And that's also a way to still research Sudan, but from other places. And we hope to, to be able to go back. The percentage of Sudanese authors, let's count, because I don't remember exactly. So no, I'm joking. But but it's a good question. We are 5 co-editors, and one was Sudanese, so it's Mahassin Abdul Jalil. So we were 4 people based in France, but actually one is Italian, me, 2, and then Mahassin Abdul Jalil. And we had maybe a third, between a third, not a half, but at least a third. And among these Sudanese authors, most of them are based in Sudan. And actually, some of them are not in Sudan anymore because of the war, but most of them were based in Sudan. And some of them, like Ahmad Alawad Sikenja, is a Sudanese historian based in the US for a long time. But that's a minority. Most of them were from with it. Politics from below, it's very much used. I'm not sure that it posits that the state is separated, is up there, and we are looking at. I think, and maybe for Sudan studies again, it's still relevant because it has not been very done. Maybe for other fields, it's like, you're again bringing this, you know, politics from below stuff. It's like, no, it's like inventer l'eau chaude, tu vois, in French. But for Sudan studies, I don't think it's the case. So yeah, maybe there are also gaps, you know, between the different fields. And it was actually mostly brought by my colleague, Lucie Revia, who is a political scientist, and so she was very, and we said, okay, there are interesting bridges between social history, which is itself not very coherent. I mean, within what we call social history, we have these totalizing histories, we have fragmenting histories, we have very different trends. So also it's a very wide field, but we found it interesting. Maybe it's also because we are from the French academic world to build these bridges between this social history and political science, because it's not so common, at least in France, even though we publish in English and not in French. And yeah, that's a very good question, the time frame. Actually, during the conference, we had some more papers about the 16th, 17th centuries, and this was very interesting because of the lack of research. There has not been really, there are some reference books, you know, on the Kingdom of Sinnar and the Darfur Sultanate. So these are Sudanese sultanates from the modern period before the 19th century. But really, there is a dearth of research on this period, so we were excited about this new research. But unfortunately, only one chapter or two made it into the book because, yeah, they were interested. They just couldn't make it. But for example, there was research based on court records from the 17th century, and yeah, no, it was. So just we need to develop more that. And does it challenge categories? That's a good question. I think the time span is also a way to bring the different disciplines together. And yeah, maybe it's also against this theology of disaster, because we have to look, you know, into further, like deeper into history to understand even 19th century, 20th century Sudan societies, and not be with this very short, you know, I don't know, short-lived or narrow perspective or presentist perspective on Sudan. And I think it's also the result of what I said before, because there are not many books and edited books on Sudan. So it's, yeah, we can bring to that. We have to use, like, to gather the people that exist and that do research on Sudan. Otherwise, you don't have any book. So yeah, and the famine and hunger. Yeah, I agree with what you said. And I have like cases in mind from the 19th century, like huge episodes of famine that, for example, during the Mahdiya, the Mahdist state, and that really shaped, you know, the social and the economic history of Sudan at that time. So yeah, maybe we should bring also more environmental history into Sudan studies. I'm doing it more now for Palestine, so I cannot really talk about that, but I think it would be a really interesting avenue for research. Environmental history applied to Sudan with these different climatic conditions also, because it stretches, you know, north and south.
We have already passed time, but we can have one more. We have room for one more question.
Okay, one question. So, just a quick question. You mentioned that Sudan was also treated like an exception, like yes, for the scholar way to approach Sudan was like an exception, right? And that made me remember that Bernardo Thibault told me not to treat Palestine as an exception. So my question is, like, as an historian, how can you, as a historian, sorry, how can you explain this way of approaching from scholars, like to this region, especially to these two fieldworks that you know very well, like an exception? why they do. Now I think in Palestine we are getting rid of that exceptionalism, and I'm glad that you have been doing the same for Sudan. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So you are asking why Sudan has been treated as an exception, actually. I think it's linked to this, what I said before about the geographical location, and like Sudan is singular, Sudan is not part of this world. It's not also quite part of this world, and it stands like floating alone. And like it's a bit caricatural, yeah, but that's the main trend. And it's also linked, I think, to the training of academics. I mean, people trained in Middle Eastern studies or trained in African studies would have different references, different theories in mind, and then will treat Sudan also differently. So even if I talked about Sudan studies as a field, we also, of course, see within this field some various, trends. And if I can just simplify the things, it's also linked to languages. So, because Sudan is a very, very, I didn't say basic things about Sudan, but it's a very, very diverse society in terms of languages, in terms of religions, ethnicities, tribes, etc. And so people trained in African studies would study Southern Sudan because it's, and then people trained in Middle Eastern studies or in Arabic, they would study Northern Sudan. So there was also a kind of, complicated maybe relationship between these two kinds of scholarships. So yeah, it's complicated inside and also outside. Yeah, so that's the same with colonial studies. Sudan is not so. In my PhD, I tried to reconnect also Sudan to the wider history of the British Empire. So, for example, by comparisons, there are connections, but also comparing how, for example, history was taught in Sudanese schools in the 1940s, in Egyptian schools, in Nigerian schools, etc., and to relink these different territories which had different statuses, also political statuses, in terms of sovereignty. And I agree with you that Palestine also has been exceptionalized and that it's less and less the case, and it's good.
Okay, thank you, Iris. With this, I close this wonderful presentation, but before I ask you for a round of applause for our presenter.